Welcome to Tending the Flame, a podcast of First UU San Diego. Each month, Reverend Justine Sullivan, Reverend Kristen Kuriga, and Director of Lifespan Faith Formation, Tony Bianca, discuss our monthly worship themes. This month, we'll discuss October's theme of deep listening. Well, hello, I'm Tony Bianca. I'm the Director of Lifespan Faith Formation, and I am here with
Reverend Justine Sullivan.
And Reverend Kristen Kuriga.
And we're back for our second episode, and this month we are talking about deep listening. So one of the questions we've been tossing around ahead of time is to think about a time that we have felt really listened to, and I wonder if anybody has any stories about that.
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind for me was when I first went off to college, I went to be a writer. And I had this professor who was a writing professor, and I just felt like when I was sharing with him about my process, he just really listened. And one of the things that I realized was he would listen, and then there would be a pause after I shared, and then he would ask me a really simple question that helped draw things out a little bit further. And it's just hard for me to even describe what it felt like, but I felt seen, I felt cared for, and I felt like he saw something in me. He thought that there was some wisdom or something that could be drawn out, not by him telling me about it from his perspective, but by asking me to go deeper within myself. And so I just loved, I thought he taught me a lot about presence and about offering one's full self, and about how to really be there for someone without making it about you, right? He made it about this cultivation. So I felt like that was the first time I was 18, and I thought, I want to be like that, right? That feeling of this is the way I want to show up with people. And that was really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was, I've been thinking that we think about the act of listening, it seems kind of passive, right? You just sit there and receive. But actually, evidence that someone has been listening, I think, is what stands with me. So if I'm talking about something, kind of thinking out loud, and then there is that pause and that moment of just synthesis where they offer back something that tells me they clearly have been listening, that's really powerful. And sometimes it helps me figure out what I mean or what I think when somebody can feed back to me what they've heard or what it makes them wonder about. Certain teachers have that gift. I'm thinking, when I was in social work school, there was this one professor who could find the pearls of wisdom in whatever anyone offered. And there have been moments of difficulty when I thought, what would Anne Fleck Henderson do? And I tried to channel her.
That's interesting. You talk about sort of both of you mentioned coming back with really a good question or the next, what they said next. And often, I think we hear that deep listening means not thinking about what you're going to say next. But I think maybe that's an oversimplification. I think a lot of listening is not spending the whole time thinking about yourself and phrasing the question, but being able to respond with something,
Right, because it's relational. And how do we experience relationship, or how do we demonstrate it? It's by offering something. But if what we're offering is actually changed by what we've heard, that's an example of listening. If what we're offering is just we waited till they took a breath and then we offered that's not really based in listening.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking of my own, when I felt listened to, and I kept coming back to the time in my life when I came out. And I don't really remember specifically any person, I don't have a physical memory of what they listened, what the listening looked like. But I remember it was the first time I would say that I felt seen. And I think there's some connection to that being listened to, especially when you're talking about deep truths about yourself, that there's some, that being listened to elicits in us that feeling of finally being seen or being recognized for who we are. There were also a lot of conversations. I mean, I was not like on the phone all the time kind of kid growing up, and suddenly there was a week where I was on the phone every minute because everybody in my inner circle was coming out to each other at the same time. So there was a lot of listening. And a lot of it was over the phone. So we were, phones were still on cords at the time. We'd have to find a quiet space to sort of set up the physical space where you could listen without interruption, and without that, you couldn't see them. You really did have to listen for all of the cues of is it time to respond, or is this just one of those quiet moments where I'm going to stay quiet and see what happens next? It required a different kind of listening, I think, but it was powerful.
I love that sense of tending to the moment, right? So you're there's different kinds of listening, but you're to me, it's a kind of deep paying attention, right? I'm paying attention to what you're sharing and about your body language and about the tone of your voice. And I'm also noticing what's happening inside me, right? What's welling up? Does it make me feel expansive or contracting, right? So there's a certain kind of noticing that's in the practice of deep listening. And something also came up for me this weekend, and this past Sunday we did a service with one of our key community partners, Denora, who is the executive director of San Diego Organizing Project. And she said something that stayed with me about how the sacred shows up in the relationship when we really listen to each other. And that she was talking about how true partnership was based on that kind of listening, where all of a sudden the spirit of life and love is in between us, because we're fully in it, fully giving ourselves to one another. And it got connected to this conversation about allyship of, this idea of I show up for you. And she said, I don't want you to show up for me. I want you to show up as your full self in relationship with me as my full self. I want us to fully see one another, to be able to see and hear each other's relationships, and then figure out how we move forward together into the community and the world that we dream about. And so there's just something for me about this idea of do we have moments when the sacred emerges or bubbles up by the way we attend or care for one another. And I feel it, and I even felt it in that moment for a second, right? Of the level of connecting. All of a sudden it was something special is happening that I can't quite describe.
Yeah. I have certainly felt that shift in my work here. I often joke about the patio on Sunday morning. Inevitably, that 20 minutes before the service starts, there are lots of people who don't see me during the week, and so they have something they want to tell me or talk about. And, sometimes it's just very transactional or logistics, but there are those other moments where you just get the feeling, this is more important. And I have to flip that switch inside myself to say, all right, this is more important than where the microphone is, or whatever else I have to do in the next 20 minutes to get ready for the service. This requires a different kind of listening. And it is something I would say sacred or special, certainly at the very least.
Right, it's you put everything down. If you have things in your hands, you put them down and fully focus on the person. And that is such a gift to receive, that kind of deep listening. And it's funny you mentioned that, right before service is the worst time for someone to approach me for a deep conversation. And yet maybe they've been waiting for that moment. And I pray that I find a way to notice when that's what's being asked of me, and that I can just do it because it's so impactful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually train. So I work with a lay ministry team and pastoral care team, and one of the things that comes up is what if I'm struggling? How do I show up for someone if there's something big happening in my life, or I'm grieving something? And we talk a lot about that balance between, right, we want you to be authentic and human and yourself, and also in this pastoral relationship where your role is really to listen, you don't want them to feel they have to take care of you. And so it's how do I both be a human being who is authentic and real and has a messy life that sometimes hurts, And how do I also show up fully for the other person? And so we talk a lot about what kind of spiritual practices can we do ahead of time. So we do some practices about like calming our bodies and our nervous system. Some people have a practice where they actually like have a box or a jar that they put something in and they ask like spirit to hold that for a little while. Spirit, can you hold my worry about my brother or this thing that and like, I remember when I proposed, you could ask like through prayer or through spiritual practice for like something to be held, and you can pick it back up when you get that, like you can put it over here. And they were like, wait, we can do that, right? So I think there's a certain balance of like the authenticity of showing up, and then also like, what is the care I have to do for my own self so that I can fully show up for someone else, so that I can be present to them in their struggles.
And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need to say, I need to take time for myself right now. And recognizing when that is important, because it's, I think we've established, it's not a passive activity. It's actually an act. It's like singing quietly. It takes more energy than singing loudly. Like you have to offer and hold back at the same time. And it's two things at once. And I think listening to the other person and noticing what it brings up in you, but then still listening in service of them. There's a lot of steps involved in that. And what is it that they want to communicate in this moment? And am I getting that? Because we can get distracted by something that they weren't intending. And that's, I would say, not careful listening. It's more me bringing my agenda.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting when you say like listening for what they intended. I was thinking in my work with kids sometimes, especially the really young kids in preschool, they don't have the verbal skills yet to be able to communicate everything that they want to. So you really do have to listen, not only to what they're saying, but like, what are they trying to say?
And what just happened?
Right, right.
That maybe I could get from context.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah, like what is that word? Or I'm not really sure. Maybe they don't even have words yet. Some of them that I work with are like 2 years old or younger. And so you're really listening for what did that word, what was that word really? Or what's going on? Like you said, what did we just do? And body language becomes much more important. The emotional affect, are they communicating something happy, or is this an emergency? And I think we forget we can do that with adults too. It's hard sometimes to say what we need to say and to listen, to not ignore the words, but to listen through the words for what else is trying to be communicated, I think is important to do.
And if there's trust, and I think that's key, to ask about the discrepancy. I mean, if someone's telling a sad story, but they've got a big smile on their face, that is curious to me. Or the reverse, telling something exciting or happy, but they seem upset, So it seems like there's more there that I might be missing.
One of the things in lay ministry that we talk about a lot too is that one of the things that keeps us from listening is we get into like fixer mode, right? Like I want to, you tell me you're hurting, and I immediately have 5 suggestions for you about what you could do to stop hurting that may be very little about you and so much about my own discomfort, right? With being with suffering, with being with pain. And so I think like working with that internal fixer, and I think one of the things that helps us sometimes in that lay ministry group is we talk a lot about trusting that the other person has their own source of wisdom and their own source of strength and lived experiences, and that you're not there to impart your wisdom, but you're there to like listen into theirs, right? To listen for their wisdom, to notice what needs to be mirrored back, to ask the question that lures out the part of them that already knows, right? Already knows the way forward. And I think that that's like a much more disciplined practice than, oh, Justine, I know what you're going through and I can fix it for you, right? And I really love the spiritual practice of that, of right, like how do we be in the brokenness with each other and like be real that life is hard and things, sometimes we suffer, and to be able to see the wholeness in someone and to like trust that that exists and that you can tend to that.
And sometimes people really just want company, not a solution.
Yeah.
And that that can be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. It's also very like ancient. It made me think of the Socratic method, right? Like philosophically, we know we're just remembering. And so sometimes people just need to talk it out. They don't, even if they ask for a solution, they may come to their own solution if we just let them talk enough,
I have colleagues that I speak with almost every week and have for years. And we think out loud about sermons or different challenges. And there's very little solution given, but often in the thinking out loud with trusted partners, truths emerge or ideas emerge. Yeah, it's really valuable. In a way that I find journaling doesn't work the same as having a live person receiving something, because there are subtle changes, right, that people make with their faces or their body language that tells me something too. Like, we are animals. We notice lots of nonverbal stuff.
Yeah.
Unconsciously, and then react to the reaction.
Yeah, and so I wonder what some of those things are. Like, we talk about body language, and I think some of them can be learned. But I think there's something that happens that's authentic that you just can't fake when you're listening to somebody.
Well, that idea of putting things down to listen. Like, if you're fidgeting with something, you're not attending, right? So.
I think often about where my feet are pointing. I have a tendency to be moving in a direction, and then if somebody starts talking to me, my feet will sort of stay in that direction. And so I must have heard it somewhere. It was probably a podcast, but so I'm conscious now of, like, if I'm listening to somebody, to like make sure my toes are pointing at them. And it helps orient the rest of me. I think in the same way you were talking about, like, putting things down. It helps focus my attention on them.
When I facilitate groups, I like to have enough room that I can actually move to where someone is and have that kind of like facing them as they're talking. So if it's a really small space, I have a hard time. I need to be able to go to where they are.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. I'm also aware of, like, what I do with my arms. I don't know. Somewhere I learned that crossing my arms was not a good idea, and so if I cross them just naturally, I will very quickly uncross them, or at least I'm conscious of where my arms are.
It actually makes me think about the training you go through to be a chaplain. And when you do chaplain residency, which is kind of like the extended intensified training, they actually took videos of us in doing a pastoral care encounter, and then had us watch the videos and watch all of the things that we do, right? The way we touch our bodies, the way that we shift, the way we hold our legs. And then we had conversations about what does that communicate to people about how they experience our listening. And wow, right? Like, what a humbling experience.
Could you put this blindfold on while we talk, please? I don't intend to communicate anything non-verbally, so.
But I'd also, right, like that self-awareness, right? Like, that's why I do think about, I love that it's like the theme this month is deep listening, but it's also the practice of deep listening. And I imagine that I will be like learning how to do that well for the rest of my life, right? Like, that it really is indeed a practice.
Yeah.
And it's interesting we've gone this far without talking about the effects of the pandemic.
Oh.
But, not being in each other's presence. And so not having those nonverbal channels available. I mean, on Zoom, even though there is the visual, it's not the same. I mean, it's from the neck up, and it's so artificial. And also, it's so easy to overlap in speech because there's that bit of a lag. So often, without intending, we'd be cutting each other off. And still we managed, but it certainly was challenging.
Well, and even those little that we're all doing right now, you can't do that on Zoom because of the overlap. I find it very frustrating to do meetings on Zoom.
I have to mute myself so I can do the and I'll just try to nod as I'm doing it. Yeah.
I also online try to be like very expressive with my face. I feel like I'm at a lot of meetings where, I don't know, people are just looking at the screen, or I don't think they're disengaged, but there's very little feedback. And I find that hard to work with.
It's like if you're acting for the stage versus the screen, right? You've got to be bigger. Right. So it's the reverse of that almost, right?
Yeah. I remember in the midst of the pandemic, what I missed the most and really surprised me was the receiving line, right? I missed that moment after worship where people come through and sometimes they don't say anything at all, right? Sometimes they just look in your eyes. Sometimes it's a simple good morning. Sometimes it's a handshake. And then sometimes it's this moment where maybe like they have something they want to tell you that's not big enough to like call you on the phone or like make a pastoral appointment, but they want to tell you that their dog died this week or that they had a hard conversation with their kid. And those moments of just like connection, I don't know, I think so much about how ministry is about relationship and about connection, but there's something for me about the felt sense that happens when we are in the same physical space. That's like a kind of listening, dare I say, like even to like energy or to like, there's a sensing that happens. And maybe I don't even have to say anything to you, but you know that like you can feel the empathy in a way that my words fail. And so there was something really healing and honestly overwhelming when the receiving line started again. Like I would find myself like crying or like moved in a way that I had maybe been easier to like hold myself together because I thought, gosh, how long we have gone without this kind of like felt care for one another.
As you're talking, it reminds me of the book Julian as a Mermaid. Do you know that book? It's a young boy, I think it's a boy, presents as a boy, with his grandmother, I think it is, on a bus or the subway, and notices like 3 drag queens and is very taken by the mermaids. And then goes on and like tries on all this, basically does his own little drag performance at home. And his grandmother is very, just supportive and accepting and takes him to see the drag queens later on. But what reminded me of it is there's maybe like 2 sentences in that whole book. It's mostly pictures, but it is an amazing story of listening and being listened to. Like the grandmother clearly has heard what Julian is trying to say and is supporting him with very few words. Like I said, maybe 2 sentences. It's just a really good book.
I love that book, and in my previous congregation, we acted out the story because that whole question of like how do you read this story, because you can't really read it because there's only very few words, and so we tried to embody it, and then we had a mermaid parade. So everyone got to be a mermaid, and we had a mermaid parade, and they played Under the Sea, and it was delightful. But yeah, I think so much is unspoken, and sometimes we think that we're like listening for the words, but I think so much of this conversation is about all the other ways that we sense and feel into relationship with each other. Right? Like this is about relationship.
Yeah. We have, by the way, Julian as a Mermaid. We have that in our collection if you want to take a look at it.
Borrow it.
There's even a sequel called Julian at the Wedding, or Julian Goes to a Wedding, which is he gets all dolled up for the wedding, which is very cute.
It's fun.
Yeah. I thought about, too, being listened to, especially as a singer. Like when you're up in front of an audience, you were talking about the energy, Reverend Kristen, in the room earlier. And sometimes that's all you have, like it's a one-sided conversation if you're performing. But there is most definitely the effect of the audience's energy. Sometimes it's nonverbal cues, but sometimes more than anything I'm seeing, there's just that feeling in the room that I know I am communicating what I want to communicate. And for me, I like applause, don't get me wrong, but for me what is better than the applause is when you've done that song and it just hits and there's this moment of silence right at the end. I don't know, something's been communicated.
That is the sweetest moment.
Yeah.
Yes, after the song ends, but it continues in the silence. If that happens, applause would end that.
Yeah.
I won't say wreck it. I want to say wreck it. Interrupts it.
Yeah.
But like, what a vulnerable thing, right? To be listened to that intently by a group of people. As someone who I don't consider myself like a particularly strong singer, I was leading a workshop this past weekend at our Day of Healing, and at the end I taught them a song, and I could feel, right, like that vulnerability of like, I'm gonna lead them in this thing that I'm not great at. And I don't know, there was maybe something about the field we had created already by the spiritual work we had done, but I felt like not the scrutiny, but the support of everyone in that room who was just like, oh, we want to learn this from you, like teach us. And so like all that support that can be communicated to through that kind of focused attention.
Yeah, I think when we risk vulnerability, we are rewarded with like deep listening, and that's the exchange part, right? It's really not one way if it's happening. And I will say, certainly as a singer, I have felt those moments of being listened to, but in prayer and it took a while for preaching to feel that way. But when I kind of reached that moment of like, wow, even though I'm the one speaking, we're having a conversation, and being able to change what I'm saying or how I'm saying it based on the feedback I'm getting, the way people are leaning in or looking confused. I mean, we do communicate. And I think that's why we don't have to worry about AI, really, because AI can't do that. Like in that moment of the relationality, it can dip into all kinds of data and present something that's compelling and looks a lot like what it's imitating, but it can't have a relationship in real time.
Yeah.
So far.
And it like can't make meaning, right? Like out of it, right? And I think that's kind of like the entire, to me, that's the entire point of church, is like here to make meaning of what it means to exist, to be in this human body, to be in this world and in this relationship. Like, what does it mean? And to like grapple with that. And so, yes, when people say, you know, AI will take things over, I think, but like, they can't help us in the meaning making. And that's what we're here for, right? In the meaning making, and that we make the meaning together, right? We heal together, we make the meaning together. It is through the relationships between each other and between the earth and something larger than us.
I've been really encouraged and relieved to hear that people say watching the services online still gives them that sense of presence. And I think it's, the technology's gotten better, and we're doing what we can to make the services work online as well. But, I remember the first time I was part of a service that was broadcast into another space. And when we said, all rise in body or spirit and sing, they rose and sang the hymn along with the piano that was, 100 yards away in another space. And it's like, we can do this.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for having this conversation again and for listening. And we hope you at home have enjoyed it, and you will tune in next month.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about First UU San Diego, you can visit our website, firstuusandiego.org, and we hope you'll tune in next month as we discuss November's theme, the practice of repair.